The biting wind of late autumn was no crueler than her father's eyes as he'd taken the widower's coin. "She's barren," Thomas Silas Blackwood had sneered, his voice a rasp of contempt. "Good for little else, but perhaps she can keep your brats from starving." Ilara had stood there, a ghost in her own life, her worn shawl clutched tight against the chill and the deeper cold of shame. Sold. Like a broken plough or a lame horse. At 24, her life had been declared a wasteland because her womb had borne no fruit for her first, short-lived marriage to a man twice her age who had cared little for her beyond that singular, unfulfilled expectation. Now, her own father, tired of the burden of an unmarried, useless daughter, had cast her off for the price of a few acres of timberland. Thomas Ashton, the buyer, stood a head taller than her father, his face etched with a weariness that seemed older than his 30-odd years. His 5 children, shadows clinging to his worn coat, stared with wide, unnerving eyes. He hadn't spoken a word during the transaction, his gaze distant, fixed on something Ilara couldn't see. Was it pity? Desperation? Or just the dull acceptance of a man making a hard choice in a hard world? As Silas pocketed the money, a grim satisfaction twisting his lips, he'd given Ilara a final shove towards her new master. "Go on, girl. Earn your keep," the words echoed in the desolate hollow of her heart. Could a life traded in such a manner ever hold an ounce of dignity? Could a woman deemed worthless by her own blood ever find a flicker of value in the eyes of strangers, in a home already overflowing with its own grief and hardship? The journey to Thomas Ashton's homestead was a silent one, broken only by the mournful creak of the wagon wheels and the occasional sniffle from the smallest child, a girl with tangled blonde hair peeking from a tattered bonnet. Ilara sat stiffly, the weight of her father's final pronouncement a physical ache. She stole glances at Thomas, his hand sure on the reins, his profile stark against the grey sky. There was no malice in his face, only a profound sadness that resonated with her own. The homestead, when they finally reached it, was little more than a collection of weathered buildings huddled against the encroaching forest. A log cabin, larger than she expected but clearly in need of repair, sagged slightly to one side. The yard was a mess of broken tools and wind-scattered debris. This was her new prison, she thought, or perhaps, her only refuge. As Thomas helped her down from the wagon, his touch surprisingly gentle, the 5 children spilled from the cabin's dim interior, their curiosity momentarily outweighing their apprehension. The eldest, a girl of perhaps 14 with her father's solemn eyes, folded her arms, her gaze openly hostile. "Another mouth to feed," she muttered, just loud enough for Ilara to hear. The sting was familiar, yet it cut deeper here, in this place where she was supposed to somehow belong. Thomas sighed, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Sarah, mind your tongue. This is Ilara. She'll be helping around the house helping. Not wife." The distinction was clear, a small mercy perhaps. Ilara offered a tentative smile, met only by suspicion from the older children and wide-eyed curiosity from the younger ones. The smallest, the little blonde girl from the wagon, hid behind Thomas's leg, one finger stuck firmly in her mouth. The inside of the cabin was cold, the hearth nearly bare. A pervasive smell of stale food and unwashed linen hung in the air. It was a place crying out for a woman's touch, any touch, but Ilara felt a tremor of inadequacy. What did she know of mothering 5 children? What did she know of mending a home that seemed as broken as her own spirit? Yet, as she looked at the grime on the rough-hewn table, at the threadbare blankets piled in a corner, a flicker of something long dormant stirred within her. A need to create order, to bring warmth. It was a small thing, this instinct, but in the vast emptiness of her despair, it felt like the first ray of a distant sun. Could this desolate place, these weary children, this grieving man, ever become something she could call home? Could she, the barren woman, somehow nurture life back into this forgotten corner of the world? The questions hung in the chilly air, as vast and unanswered as the wilderness that pressed in on all sides. The first few days were a blur of hesitant movements and unspoken anxieties. Ilara moved like a wraith through the Ashton cabin, her presence a quiet question mark in the already unsettled lives of its occupants. The children watched her every move. Sarah, the eldest, maintained a frosty distance, her disapproval a palpable force. 12-year-old James, a smaller, wirier version of his father, was gruffly indifferent, focused on his outdoor chores. 9-year-old Martha, sharp-featured and observant, simply stared, her gaze unsettlingly direct. Only 7-year-old Samuel, a boy with a shock of unruly brown hair and a perpetually smudged face, showed occasional, fleeting curiosity, and little Lily, barely 4, would sometimes pause in her solitary play to peer at Elara from behind a piece of furniture, her thumb still firmly in her mouth. Elara began where she could, with the dirt. She scrubbed the floors until her knuckles were raw, scoured the soot-stained fireplace, and washed load after load of neglected laundry in the icy creek water, her hands turning blue with cold. She found a forgotten patch of herbs near the cabin and carefully tended to it, recognizing a few hardy survivors that might lend some flavor to their meager meals. The cabin slowly began to shed its air of neglect. Sunlight, filtered through newly cleaned window panes, fell on swept floors. The scent of baking bread, a skill her own mother had painstakingly taught her, began to replace the stale odors. Thomas said little, but Elara noticed his gaze lingering on the mended curtains, the neatly stacked firewood, the surprisingly palatable stew she managed to conjure from their sparse pantry. His weariness seemed to lessen, if only by a fraction. One afternoon, Lily, playing with a crudely carved wooden doll whose arm had come loose, began to cry softly. Elara, mending one of James's torn shirts by the weak firelight, looked up. Sarah ignored her sister, engrossed in a tattered book. Martha and Samuel were outside. Hesitantly, Elara put down her sewing. "May I see, Lily?" she asked, her voice gentle. The little girl, startled, clutched the doll tighter, then, after a moment's internal struggle, held it out. Elara took the doll, examined the dangling arm, and then, retrieving her needle and a sturdy thread, carefully reattached it, her stitches small and neat. She even added a tiny, embroidered smile to the doll's blank face. When she handed it back, Lily's eyes, the color of a summer sky, widened. A slow, shy smile spread across her face. She didn't speak, but she reached out a small, sticky hand and patted Elara's arm before scurrying away with her mended treasure. It was the first unsolicited touch, the first crack in the wall of childish suspicion. That evening, as Elara served the simple meal, she felt Thomas's eyes on her. When she met his gaze, there was a warmth there, a hint of gratitude that went beyond her domestic efforts. "The cabin feels different," he said, his voice quiet. "Cleaner." "Warmer," Elara merely nodded, a flush rising to her cheeks. Inside, a tiny, fragile seed of hope pushed through the barren soil of her heart. Perhaps, just perhaps, she could be more than just good for little else. Perhaps, even here, in this forgotten place, she could earn something more precious than her keep. She could earn a place. The subtle shift that began with Lily's mended doll rippled outwards, slowly transforming the atmosphere within the Ashton cabin. Samuel, emboldened by his younger sister's acceptance, started to hover near Elara as she worked, asking endless questions about her tasks. He was fascinated by the way she could coax a flame from damp kindling, the skill with which she darned socks until they looked almost new. Elara answered his queries with patience, finding his boyish curiosity a welcome change from the heavy silence or outright hostility she'd initially encountered. She even taught him how to knead bread dough, his small hands struggling comically with the sticky mass, resulting in a lopsided but proudly presented loaf. Martha, ever watchful, began to offer small, hesitant assistances. She'd fetch water without being asked, or quietly set the table. One evening, she found Elara struggling to untangle a particularly stubborn knot in a ball of yarn. After a moment of observation, Martha reached out. "Let me try," she said, her voice surprisingly soft. Her nimble fingers worked at the knot with a focused intensity, and soon, the yarn lay smooth and untangled. Elara smiled. "Thank you, Martha." "You have clever hands." A faint blush touched Martha's cheeks, and she quickly looked away, but the wall around her had visibly lowered. Sarah remained the most formidable challenge. She saw Elara's efforts not as kindness, but as a calculated attempt to replace her mother, a memory Sarah guarded with fierce loyalty. She would often make pointed remarks about how her mother used to do things, her voice sharp with grief and resentment. Ilara never argued, never tried to defend herself. She simply absorbed the barbs with a quiet sorrow, understanding the pain that fueled them. One blustery afternoon, Sarah was attempting to mend a tear in her father's favorite woolen coat, her stitches clumsy and uneven, her frustration mounting. Ilara, seeing her struggle, gently approached. "Perhaps if you use a smaller stitch, Sarah," she suggested softly, "and pull the thread less tightly, it won't pucker." So Sarah stiffened, ready to lash out, but then her shoulders slumped. She thrust the coat at Ilara. "Here. You do it then, if you're so clever." Ilara took the coat, her heart aching for the girl's unhappiness. She sat down and began to work, her needle moving with practiced ease. She didn't just mend the tear, she reinforced the worn fabric around it, her stitches nearly invisible. When she finished, she handed it back to Sarah. "Your mother must have taken very good care of this coat for it to last so long," Ilara said quietly. "It's a fine piece of wool." Sarah stared at the mended coat, then at Ilara, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. She said nothing, but later that evening, Ilara noticed her wearing a shawl her mother had knitted, a shawl Ilara had carefully washed and folded earlier that week. It was a small, silent acknowledgement. Thomas, meanwhile, was a constant, steady presence. He witnessed these slow thaws with a quiet relief that softened the harsh lines around his eyes. He began to seek out Ilara's company in the evenings, after the children were asleep. They would sit by the fire, not always talking, but sharing a comfortable silence. He told her about his late wife, Mary, about their dreams for the homestead, his voice filled with a gentle sorrow. Ilara listened, offering quiet empathy, never trying to fill the void Mary had left, but simply acknowledging its existence. One night, a fierce storm raged outside, rattling the shutters and sending gusts of icy wind through the cabin's crevices. Lily, terrified by the thunder, woke screaming. Before Thomas could react, Ilara was by the little girl's side, gathering her into a warm embrace, murmuring soothing words until Lily's sobs subsided into hiccuping breaths. She held her until she drifted back to sleep, her small body nestled trustingly against Ilara's. When Ilara finally rose, she found Thomas watching her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "You're good with them," he said, his voice raspy with emotion. "Better than I deserve." The unspoken hung between them, a fragile bridge of shared experience and growing tenderness. The label the Baron felt distant, a cruel word from another life, as she held the warmth of a sleeping child against her heart. The rhythm of life on the homestead settled into a pattern of shared work and quiet companionship. The cabin, once a place of stark grief and neglect, now hummed with a fragile domesticity. Laughter, hesitant at first, then more frequent, echoed within its walls, particularly from the younger children who now orbited Ilara like devoted planets. Lily was her constant shadow, her small hand often finding its way into Ilara's. Samuel chatted incessantly, sharing his discoveries from the woods and fields. Even Martha would occasionally offer a shy smile or a piece of local gossip gleaned from her solitary rambles. Sarah remained reserved, but the sharp edges of her hostility had softened into a wary observation. She saw the genuine care Ilara showed her siblings, the tireless work she put into making their lives more comfortable. She saw her father's weariness lessen, a lightness return to his eyes that had been absent for too long. One crisp morning, as Ilara was hanging laundry on the line, the scent of wood smoke and damp earth filling the air, young Samuel came running towards her, his face alight with excitement. "Ilara! Ilara! Come see!" He tugged her hand, leading her towards the small, struggling vegetable patch she had painstakingly coaxed back to life. There, pushing through the dark soil, were the first tiny green shoots of carrots and beans. Ilara knelt, her heart swelling with a quiet joy. It was such a small thing, yet it felt like a miracle. "They're beautiful, Samuel," she whispered, tracing a delicate sprout with her fingertip. Even Thomas, mending a fence nearby, paused to look, a rare smile touching his lips. "You have a gift with growing things, Ilara," he said, his gaze meeting hers over the children's heads, a warmth passing between them that had nothing to do with the morning sun. That afternoon, Thomas announced he needed to go into the nearby settlement of Oak Haven for supplies. "I'd like it if you came with me, Ilara," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes held a hopeful request. The children can manage for a few hours. Elara felt a flutter of trepidation mixed with a surprising anticipation. It would be her first foray into the community since her arrival. As they rode in the wagon, the silence between them was comfortable, filled with the creak of the wheels and the rustle of autumn leaves. But as they approached Oak Haven, a cluster of rough-hewn buildings dominated by a general store and a small church, Elara felt a familiar tightening in her chest. She saw the curious glances from women sweeping their porches, the way men paused in their conversations to stare. Whispers seemed to follow them like autumn leaves skittering in the wind. Inside the general store, the air was thick with the scent of coffee, leather, and unspoken judgment. Mrs. Henderson, the storekeeper's wife, a woman with a pinched face and eyes like sharp little buttons, pursed her lips as Thomas made his purchases. "Quite a full household you have now, Mr. Ashton," she remarked, her voice dripping with insinuation. And so soon after poor Mary's passing, Elara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, the old shame prickling at her skin. But before she could shrink away, Thomas stepped slightly in front of her, his presence a silent shield. "Elara is a blessing to me and my children, Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We're managing just fine." He paid for his goods, took Elara's arm gently, and led her from the store, his head held high. Outside, the whispers seemed louder, more pointed. "Baron, they say," a woman hissed to her companion, just loud enough for Elara to overhear. "Shameful, taking on another man's leavings when she couldn't even give her own husband a child." The words struck Elara like a physical blow, threatening to shatter the fragile peace she had begun to build. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. Thomas squeezed her arm. "Don't listen to them, Elara," he murmured, his voice rough with anger. "They don't know you. They don't know your worth." His defense, so simple and direct, was a balm to her wounded spirit. It didn't erase the sting, but it drew them closer, two solitary souls weathering the storm of societal disapproval together. The bond between them, forged in hardship and quiet understanding, was deepening, becoming a sanctuary against the harsh judgments of the outside world. The return journey from Oak Haven was subdued. The cruel whispers in the settlement had cast a shadow, reminding Elara of the precariousness of her position, the fragility of her newfound sense of belonging. Thomas, sensing her distress, tried to fill the silence with talk of the coming winter, of plans for the homestead, but Elara found it difficult to shake off the chill of the town's disapproval. Her father's pronouncement, "good for little else," echoed in her mind, a venomous refrain. For days, a quiet melancholy clung to her. The children, intuitive as always, sensed the shift. Lily became clingier, Samuel less boisterous. Even Sarah seemed to regard her with a hesitant concern, though she said nothing. One evening, as Elara sat by the fire, her mending lying forgotten in her lap, lost in thought, a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see Thomas standing there, a worried frown creasing his brow. He sat down beside her, the rough wooden bench creaking under his weight. "Those gossips in town," he began, his voice low, "they don't define you, Elara. What they say, it's born of ignorance and small minds." Elara picked at a loose thread on her apron. "But what if they're right, Thomas? What if my father was right?" The words were barely a whisper, freighted with years of ingrained shame. "I couldn't give my first husband a child. I am, Baron." Thomas reached out and gently covered her restless hands with his own. His touch was warm, calloused, and surprisingly comforting. "Being a woman, Elara, being a wife, it's more than just bearing children. My Mary, God rest her soul, she gave me 5 beautiful children. But she was also my friend, my partner. She made this cabin a home. You're doing that too. You're bringing life back to this place, to my children." To me his gaze was earnest, his sincerity undeniable. "What you've done here, the kindness you've shown, the strength, that's worth more than anything." His words were like water on parched earth, sinking deep into the wounded places within her. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not a man who had bought her out of desperation, but a man who saw her, Elara, the person, not the label. A fragile hope, stronger this time, unfurled within her. A few weeks later, as the first snows of winter began to dust the skeletal branches of the trees, a different kind of shadow fell upon the homestead. A horseman, lean and hard-eyed, rode into their yard. Ilara, fetching water from the well, felt a jolt of pure, cold fear. She recognized him instantly. Jedediah Croft. A man her father had once tried to marry her off to before her first marriage, a man known for his cruel temper and grasping nature. Croft dismounted, his eyes, like chips of flint, raking over Ilara, then taking in the cabin, the children who had cautiously emerged onto the porch. "Well, well," Croft drawled, a smirk twisting his thin lips. "Silas Blackwood told me he'd found a new home for his barren daughter. Didn't expect it to be quite so rustic." He spat on the ground. "He also mentioned he might have sold you too cheap." Ashton Thomas stepped out of the barn, his face grim. "State your business, Croft, and then be on your way." "My business." Croft chuckled, a humorless sound. "Silas has had second thoughts. Seems he thinks he was swindled. He sent me to renegotiate. Or perhaps, to bring Ilara back. A woman should be with her kin, after all, especially one with deficiencies." Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. Her father, not content with selling her once, was now trying to profit from her again, or worse, drag her back to the suffocating misery of his house. The children, sensing the menace in Croft's voice, huddled closer together. Sarah instinctively pulled Lily behind her. The past, which she had so desperately tried to leave behind, had found her, its greedy hands reaching out to reclaim her. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Ilara, but as Jedediah Croft's leering gaze swept over the children, something else ignited within her, a fierce, protective anger. These children, who had slowly, cautiously opened their hearts to her, were now threatened by this echo from her wretched past. Thomas moved to stand beside her, his stance solid, unyielding. "Ilara is my wife," he stated, his voice low and dangerous. "She's not going anywhere with you." And Silas Blackwood made his bargain. "There's nothing to renegotiate." Croft's smirk widened. "Wife, is it? A quick wedding for a barren woman and a desperate widower. Touching. But Silas holds her father's rights. He feels he was cheated. He wants more for her, or he wants her back. He says you tricked him about the value of that timberland you traded." "There was no trickery," Thomas countered, his fists clenching at his sides. "The deal was fair, and it's done." Ilara found her voice, shaky but resolute. "I will not go back, Mr. Croft. My place is here now." Her eyes met Thomas's, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken truth that had grown between them. This was more than a bargain, it was becoming a home. Croft laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You don't have a say in it, girl. You belong to your father until he rightly disposes of you. And he sent me to collect." He took a step forward, his hand reaching towards Ilara's arm. Before Thomas could react, James, who had been silent until now, darted forward, placing himself between Ilara and Croft. "Leave her alone," the boy cried, his voice surprisingly strong for his 12 years, his small frame trembling but defiant. Samuel and Martha quickly flanked him, their faces pale but determined. Sarah, holding Lily tightly, glared at Croft with an animosity that mirrored her father's. Croft paused, a flicker of surprise in his eyes at the children's unified defense. He sneered. "Brave little pups, ain't why, eh? Defending your new mama." He looked back at Ilara. "Seems you've bewitched them good." "They're good children, defending what's right," Thomas said, his hand resting on James's shoulder. "Now, I'll say it one last time, Croft. Leave my property. And tell Silas Blackwood that Ilara is under my protection. If he or any man he sends comes here again threatening my family, they'll regret it." The threat in Thomas's voice was unmistakable. Croft hesitated, his gaze shifting from Thomas's resolute face to the determined children, and finally to Ilara, who stood her ground, her fear now overshadowed by a burgeoning courage. He was outnumbered, and perhaps he sensed that Thomas Ashton was not a man to be trifled with when his family was threatened. "This ain't over, Ashton," Croft snarled, backing towards his horse. "Silas won't let this go. You'll be hearing from us." He mounted his horse, gave Ilara one last venomous look, and then galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy silence in his wake. As the sound of hoofbeats faded, Ilara let out a shaky breath. The children rushed to her, Lily burying her face in Ilara's skirt, Samuel and Martha clinging to her hands. James looked up at her, his eyes shining with a fierce loyalty. "We won't let him take you, Ilara," he said. Sarah, for the first time, met Ilara's gaze directly, a grudging respect dawning in her eyes. "Father's right," she said quietly. "Your place is here." Ilara knelt and hugged them all fiercely, her heart overflowing. In their small, brave stand, they had claimed her as their own, just as she had claimed them in her heart. The external threat had only served to solidify the bonds of their unconventional family, and in facing it, Ilara had found a strength she never knew she possessed. She was no longer just the barren woman, the purchased wife. She was a protector, a defender, a cherished part of this family. And she would fight for them, just as they were willing to fight for her. The departure of Jedediah Croft left an uneasy tension hanging over the Ashton homestead. Though he was gone, his threat lingered, a dark cloud on the horizon. Ilara found herself jumping at sudden noises, her nights troubled by anxious dreams of her father's grasping hands, of Croft's cruel smirk. Yet, amidst the fear, a new resolve had taken root. The children's unwavering support, Thomas's steadfast protection, these were anchors in the storm. She would not allow her past to destroy the fragile happiness she had found. Thomas, ever observant, noticed her underlying anxiety. He became even more attentive, his presence a constant reassurance. He took to checking the perimeter of the homestead more frequently and kept his rifle close at hand. But more than these practical measures, it was his quiet confidence in her, in them, that bolstered Ilara's courage. "We'll face whatever comes, Ilara," he said one evening, as they sat by the fire after the children were asleep. Together his hand found hers, his grip strong and steady. The words together resonated deeply within her, a promise of shared burdens and mutual strength. A few weeks passed, and the initial alarm began to subside, replaced by a watchful vigilance. Life settled back into its routine, but with a subtle difference. The bond between Ilara and the family had been tempered in the fire of Croft's threat, emerging stronger and more resilient. Sarah, in particular, had undergone a noticeable change. The icy wall she had maintained around herself had finally melted. She began to seek Ilara's company, asking for her help with sewing, confiding in her about her worries and dreams. She even started calling her Ilara Mama in unguarded moments, a term of endearment that brought tears to Ilara's eyes. The true test, however, came sooner than they expected. One cold morning, as a thin layer of frost coated the ground, not one, but 3 riders approached the homestead. At their head was Silas Blackwood himself, his face a mask of grim determination. Beside him rode Jedediah Croft, a look of smug anticipation on his face. The third man was a stranger, burly and mean-looking. Ilara's heart plummeted. Thomas, who had been chopping wood, immediately straightened, his axe still in hand, his expression hardening. The children, playing near the cabin, froze, then scurried towards Ilara, who stood on the porch, her hands clenched into fists. "Thomas Ashton!" Silas Blackwood boomed, his voice carrying across the yard. "I've come for what's mine. You deceived me, traded worthless land for my daughter. I'm here to take her back and demand proper compensation." "I deceived no one, Silas," Thomas called back, his voice ringing with authority. "The land was as described. The bargain was struck. Ilara is my wife, and she stays here a wife." Silas spat. "She's a barren burden, and you know it. You took advantage of my generosity." "Generosity." Ilara's voice, surprisingly clear and strong, cut through the tense air. She stepped forward, her fear a cold knot in her stomach, but her eyes blazing with a newfound fire. "You call selling your own daughter generosity, father? You cast me off like unwanted refuse." Silas looked taken aback by her defiance. "Hold your tongue, girl. You'll do as you're told." "No," Ilara said, her voice gaining strength. "I will not. My life is here now, with my husband and these children. They value me. They love me. Something you never understood, Croft sneered. Big words for a woman who can't even fulfill her basic duty, her duty. Thomas stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Elara. Her duty is to be a good wife and mother, and she is more than fulfilling that. These children love her. I love her. And that is more valuable than any price you could name. The words "I love her" hung in the air, a stunning, heartfelt declaration that resonated through Elara, chasing away the last vestiges of her fear. She looked at Thomas, her heart swelling with an emotion so powerful it almost overwhelmed her. Silas seemed momentarily speechless, but Croft urged him on. "Don't listen to him, Silas. Take the girl. She's yours by right." Croft and the other man began to dismount, their intentions clear. This was it. The confrontation she had dreaded. But Elara was no longer the timid, broken woman her father had sold. She stood tall, her gaze unwavering. As Croft advanced, Thomas raised his axe slightly. "I'm warning you, Croft." Don't take another step. Just then, a new sound reached them, the jingle of harnesses, the rumble of a wagon. Coming up the track was Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper from Oak Haven, and beside him, his wife, her pinched face unusually animated. And behind them, on horseback, was Pastor Davies. Mrs. Henderson, it turned out, while a gossip, also possessed a keen sense of injustice. She had been troubled by Thomas's quiet dignity and Elara's evident distress during their visit, and Croft's subsequent boasting in the town saloon about reclaiming Elara had set her suspicions alight. She had spoken to Pastor Davies, a man respected for his fairness. "Silas Blackwood!" Pastor Davies called out, his voice firm. "What is the meaning of this disturbance?" Silas, clearly flustered by the unexpected arrivals, stammered, "This is a family matter, Pastor. This man, Ashton, cheated me." "I've heard a different story, Silas," Pastor Davies said, his gaze stern. "I've heard you sold your daughter, and now you seek to profit further from her misery. I've also heard," he added, his eyes resting on Elara with kindness, "that this woman has found a good home here, and has become a true mother to these children and a good wife to Thomas Ashton." And Mrs. Henderson, surprisingly, spoke up. "Indeed. I've seen her with the children. She's a good woman. Thomas Ashton is a good man." "Leave them be, Silas." Croft, seeing the tide turning against them, tried to bluster. "She's barren. He has no right to keep her if her father wants her back." Pastor Davies fixed Croft with a steely gaze. "A woman's worth is not solely in her womb, Mr. Croft. It is in her heart, her character, her actions. And from what I see and hear, Elara Ashton is a woman of great worth." He then turned to Silas. "Go home, Silas. Your claim here is baseless and cruel. These people deserve peace." Silas Blackwood looked from the determined pastor to the resolute Thomas, to his daughter who now stood with a quiet, unshakable dignity he had never seen in her before. He saw the protective circle of the children, the stern disapproval of the Hendersons. Defeated, his bluster deflated, he glared at Elara one last time. "You're no daughter of mine," he muttered, then turned his horse and, followed by a sullen Croft and their hired man, rode away, this time for good. The silence that descended was profound, broken only by Lily's quiet sniffle as she clung to Elara's leg. Elara sank to her knees, relief washing over her in a dizzying wave. It was over. Her past had been faced, and it no longer had power over her. The dust settled in the wake of Silas Blackwood's ignominious retreat, leaving behind a quiet field of victory. Elara felt as though a tremendous weight had been lifted from her soul. Pastor Davies and the Hendersons offered words of support and encouragement before taking their leave, Mrs. Henderson even giving Elara's hand a surprisingly warm squeeze. "You've got a good family here, dear," she'd said, her earlier sharpness completely gone. As their wagon disappeared down the track, Elara turned to Thomas, her eyes shining with unshed tears. He stood watching her, his expression filled with a tender pride that made her heart ache with happiness. The children, sensing the finality of the confrontation, swarmed around them, their relief palpable. James clapped his father on the back, while Sarah gave Elara a fierce hug. Little Lily, no longer scared, beamed up at them. Later that evening, after the children were finally settled in their beds, a deep peace enveloped the cabin. The fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Elara sat on the small bench, her hands clasped in her lap, replaying the events of the day, replaying Thomas's powerful declaration, "I love her." Thomas came to sit beside her, taking her hands in his. The rough warmth of his touch sent a shiver through her. "Are you all right, Elara?" he asked softly, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. She met his gaze, her heart too full for words. She simply nodded, a slow smile spreading across her face. You said you loved me," she whispered, the words feeling wondrous and new on her tongue. Thomas's eyes softened, a gentle light illuminating their depths. "I do, Elara," he affirmed, his voice husky with emotion. "I think I started falling in love with you the day you mended Lily's doll. I saw the kindness in you, the strength you tried so hard to hide. You've brought light back into this home, into our lives. You've mended more than just torn clothes and broken toys. You've mended broken hearts, including mine." Tears welled in Elara's eyes, spilling over to trace warm paths down her cheeks. "Oh, Thomas," she breathed, "I love you too. I never imagined I could find such happiness, such acceptance." He leaned closer, his gaze searching hers. "Your father was wrong, Elara. So wrong. You are not barren of worth. Your heart is the most fertile ground I know, full of love and goodness." And then, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion born of sudden desire, but a kiss of deep, abiding affection, a seal on the promises their hearts had already made. It was a kiss that spoke of shared sorrows and discovered joys, of respect, and of a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. In that moment, all the pain of her past, the shame of her father's cruelty, the sting of societal judgment, faded into insignificance. She was Elara Ashton, beloved wife, cherished mother, a woman of immeasurable worth. The homestead, once a symbol of her desperate bargain, now felt like a sanctuary, a true home built on the foundations of resilience, kindness, and a love that had defied all odds. The children slept soundly, secure in the knowledge that their family was whole, protected. And as Elara rested her head on Thomas's shoulder, the warmth of the fire on her face, she knew a peace she had never dreamed possible. Her transformation was complete, the devalued outcast had found her voice, her strength, and her heart's true haven. The future stretched before them, no longer a frightening unknown, but a path to be walked together, hand in hand. The seasons turned, each one knitting the Ashton family closer. The harsh winter, which had witnessed the final severing of Elara's painful past, gave way to a vibrant spring. Under Elara's nurturing hand, the small vegetable patch flourished, yielding a bounty that supplemented their table and even allowed for small acts of generosity towards neighbors. The cabin itself seemed to breathe with a new life, colorful wildflowers picked by Lily graced the windowsill, Sarah's increasingly skilled needlework added touches of beauty, and the aroma of Elara's baking was a constant, comforting presence. Thomas's love for Elara deepened with each passing day, a quiet, steadfast devotion that enveloped her in a sense of unwavering security. He consulted her on matters of the farm, valued her opinions, and cherished the easy companionship that had grown between them. Their evenings by the fire were filled with shared stories, laughter, and the comfortable silences of two people perfectly attuned to one another. The children thrived. James, now a lanky youth, worked alongside his father with a newfound maturity, his earlier gruffness replaced by a quiet respect for both Thomas and Elara. Sarah blossomed into a capable young woman, her mother's gentle spirit shining through, now complemented by Elara's practical wisdom. Martha's sharp intelligence found an outlet in helping Elara with remedies and household management, while Samuel's boundless energy was channeled into exploring every inch of their land, always returning with tales and treasures for Elara. Mama Lily, no longer the timid, thumb-sucking toddler, was a whirlwind of giggles and affection, her world secure and bright. The community of Oak Haven, too, underwent a transformation in its perception of Elara. Pastor Davies had spoken warmly of her character from his pulpit, and Mrs. Henderson, now a staunch ally, made it a point to greet Elara with genuine friendliness whenever they met. Stories of Elara's kindness, her resourcefulness, and the remarkable change she had wrought in the Ashton household began to circulate, eclipsing the earlier cruel whispers. One Sunday, after the church service, several women from the congregation approached Ilara, not with judgment, but with requests for her scone recipe or advice on mending delicate fabrics. Mrs. Higgins, the notorious town gossip who had once made cutting remarks, even offered a hesitant, almost apologetic smile and complimented the children on their well-behaved manner. Ilara accepted these gestures with grace, her heart lighter than it had ever been. She found herself participating in community gatherings, first with trepidation, then with growing confidence. At the spring festival, Thomas proudly escorted her, the children trailing happily behind them. They were no longer the subjects of pity or scorn, but a respected family, a testament to the power of love and resilience. Ilara discovered within herself a quiet joy in helping others. She shared her knowledge of herbs with a neighbor whose child was ailing, helped another woman piece a quilt for a new baby, her hands, once deemed useless, now instruments of comfort and creation. Her infertility, the brand that had once defined her worthlessness, became an increasingly irrelevant footnote to a life rich in purpose and love. She was a mother in every way that mattered, her heart overflowing with affection for the 5 children who called her their own. The homestead wasn't just a place of refuge anymore, it was a place of belonging, a place where she was not only accepted but celebrated for who she was. The laughter of the children, the steady presence of her husband, the burgeoning acceptance of the community, these were the fruits of a life reclaimed, a testament to her confirmed self-worth. 2 years had passed since Silas Blackwood's final, defeated departure. The Ashton homestead was a picture of rustic prosperity and familial bliss. The cabin had been expanded, a new room added with Thomas's carpentry skills and James's eager assistance, providing more space for their growing family. The fields yielded good harvests, and their small herd of livestock had increased. More importantly, the home was filled with an enduring warmth that radiated from the love shared within its walls. Ilara, now 26, moved with a quiet confidence that transformed her. The timidity was gone, replaced by a serene assurance. Her eyes, once haunted by sorrow and fear, now shone with a clear, bright light, reflecting the love that surrounded her and the deep contentment she felt. She was the heart of their home, her days filled with the rhythms of caring for her family, tending her garden, and managing their household with skill and grace. Thomas watched her often, a tender smile playing on his lips. The lines of weariness on his face had softened, replaced by an expression of profound happiness. Their love was a quiet, powerful force, a steady flame that warmed every corner of their lives. It was in the shared glances over the breakfast table, the comfortable silences as they worked side by side, the gentle touch of hands in the evening. The children were growing, each one a testament to the nurturing environment Ilara and Thomas had created. Sarah, at 16, was a beautiful and capable young woman, her mother's memory cherished but no longer a source of pain, her bond with Ilara deep and true. James, a strong and responsible 14-year-old, was his father's right hand, already showing signs of the fine man he would become. Martha, with her keen mind and gentle spirit, was Ilara's shadow in the kitchen and garden, absorbing her wisdom. Samuel, a boisterous 9-year-old, filled their days with adventure and laughter, and Lily, a sunny 6-year-old, was the darling of the family, her days filled with songs and imaginary games, her hand always finding its way into Ilara's or Thomas's. One late summer afternoon, Ilara sat on the porch swing Thomas had built, a basket of mending in her lap. The air was warm, filled with the drowsy hum of bees in her flower garden and the distant laughter of the children playing by the creek. Thomas came to sit beside her, slipping an arm around her shoulders. She leaned into his embrace, a sigh of pure contentment escaping her lips. "Happy," he murmured, his lips brushing her hair. "More than I ever thought possible," she whispered, her gaze sweeping over the peaceful scene, their home, their children, their life. The label of barren, once a source of such profound shame, rarely crossed her mind anymore. If it did, it was only as a distant memory of a pain that had been healed, a judgment that had been proven utterly false. Her worth was not, and had never been, tied to her womb. It resided in her spirit, her capacity for love, her resilience, her kindness, qualities that had blossomed and flourished in the fertile ground of acceptance and affection. She had been sold, devalued, and discarded, but in the heart of a struggling widower and his 5 children, she had found not just a refuge, but a redemption. She had discovered her true self, a woman of strength, courage, and infinite worth. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Elara looked at Thomas, her heart overflowing. The peace she felt was deep and abiding, a security woven from the threads of shared love and mutual respect. Her journey had been one from profound hardship to enduring happiness, a testament to the redemptive power of kindness and the unwavering strength of the human spirit. Here, in this haven they had built together, Elara Ashton was home, cherished, and whole.